Let's actually turn to another critically important issue, and that is Cuba, which is experiencing some very difficult circumstances right now, but they are not exactly just random. There's a lot behind it. And by a lot, I mean the United States government. To talk more about this, we are very honored to be joined by Manolo De Los Santos, who is, among many other superlatives I could list, the co executive director of the People's Forum and a researcher at Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. Manolo, thanks so much for being back with us.
Thank you for having me on again.
Well, listen, it's there is no other choice to talk about this because I think there's so much misinformation here. I mean, Cuba's been going through extreme blackouts, and the way that it's often presented is this is just the long-term mismanagement of socialism, that there's just nothing else that's going on. So without me editorializing too much, I mean, what is behind the blackouts that we've seen in Cuba?
Well, for the US government, it's always so easy to deny any responsibility at all, to say that Cuba is a failed state, and somehow never admit that its sanctions have any impact on the Cuban economy and on the Cuban people. What's been happening is, in fact, not a story of this past week, but actually a story of the past few years, which is that since Trump put in place a series of sanctions that specifically target Cuba's ability to import fuel, and not just fuel, but even the opportunity to import spare parts for its electrical grid, that electrical grid has severely deteriorated to the point that it needs massive, and I would say almost billionaire repairs to a system in order to continue operating. Add to this that since Cuba was added to the state sponsors of terrorism list by Trump at the very end of his administration, literally in January as he was about to leave the White House, it has also meant that Cuba is not allowed to make the majority of its financial transactions with banks around the world in order to even try to purchase these fuels or spare parts on other markets. Meaning the perfect storm was created so that sooner or later, like it did last week, Cuba would be caught in a situation where its electrical grid, under high demand because of the extreme weather of these past few months in Cuba, would be forced to crash. And there are many grids around the world that are facing this similar situation in Nigeria, in Puerto Rico, in many other parts of the world. But only in Cuba are the hands of the government literally tied to their backs, being prevented from being able to solve this problem with normal measures. Cubans instead have to resort to their ingenuity, to their creativity, to basically reformulate with the parts that they already have a solution for this national grid. And after 3.5 days of severe blackout, the Cubans brought the national grid back on. But the larger question remains, which is how long can Cuba continue to sort of make small repairs to this national electoral grid when they are not able to make the necessary repairs that are impeded by the US blockade and these vicious sanctions that Trump put in place, but Biden has kept all these years after.
Yeah, I think the irony is the way that the U.S. frames this as, oh, it's just the mismanagement of socialism, when actually it's capitalism, it's American capitalism, American imperialism, is what's doing this. And I think it's hard for people sometimes to wrap their heads around what you're explaining, because this is why sanctions can be effective in that narrative, because they take time, especially when it comes to infrastructure decay. And I remember when I was looking into the electricity infrastructure of Syria and how it's just completely deteriorated over the last 10 years, specifically because of US sanctions. It's like electricity infrastructure, power plants, they need constant spare parts all the time. You have to have like a constant backup of everything, because everything is always breaking and needs to be replaced, because there's such high demand on that sort of infrastructure. And so if you can't constantly get in these spare, like parts of machines you've never even heard of, right? It's like, it's eventually going to fail. And I want to ask you also, Manolo, because Cuba, of course, putting them on the state sponsor of terrorism list, and then also the added sanctions under Trump that Biden kept intact, in addition to the blockade Cuba's already subjected to for over 60 years. On top of that, there's sanctions on Venezuela that have impacted Cuba? Because if I'm not mistaken, Venezuela used to give fuel to Cuba. So that's like a secondary way that sanctions hurt Cuba. Could you talk a little bit about that aspect of this as well? Though I'm not sure if that contributed specifically to this outage, but it does impact Cuba's ability to access fuel.
But I think you bring a very important point, Rania, which is we're not just talking about the sanctions or the blockade against Cuba. We're actually living in a world where the US sanctions a third of the countries on the planet, and that affects all of the countries involved. Because ultimately, if the sanctions by the US were only limited to US companies, you could say, well, countries like Cuba or Syria or Venezuela or Zimbabwe then have other opportunities to trade with other countries. But the reality is that all these sanctions placed by the US are internationally applied by what, in my opinion, is a rogue state called the United States. I mean, these are extraterritorial applications of US law, to the point that I have a very recent experience. I just was hearing from colleagues in Cuba where they were purchasing spare parts, for example, from a French company that was going to ship spare parts for Cuba's electrical grid, but that halfway as they were being shipped to Cuba, they were stopped. They were literally, the ship was turned around because the US literally had to tell the French company that one of the spare parts had a small percentage of US components and therefore could not be sold to Cuba.
Oh, man.
This applies to the ships that Cuba uses to apply to buy fuel for its national grid. Many times coming from Venezuela. Venezuela and Cuba are not that far apart physically, but even ships between Venezuela and Cuba are sanctioned literally from doing that trade. So we live in a world where we're going to have to create an alternative system that we really hope is born out of BRICS, out of a new multipolarity, but that effectively challenges the US rogue state rule of disorder and impose terror on the people of the world. I mean, imagine a world in which not just the Cuban people, but millions of people on the planet are subject to the whims of the Department of Treasury and OFAC.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Manolo, I think one of the other factors here is that even in the context of the blackout and all these other challenges, the sort of broader Cuban revolutionary process was not inert. I mean, like, obviously, I'm glad you mentioned Nigeria. You know, the power's off all the time, and the government is just like, oh, sorry, hope it works out for you next time. But, I think I want you to talk a little bit about what we saw, the forms of social solidarity, the different pieces that emerged in Cuba, and that kind of, I hate to even say like the government, like sort of like the merging of the sort of the people's aspirations and the governmental apparatus that can kind of spring into action. And even if it's not 100% adequate, can at least try to meet people's needs as much as you can under very difficult circumstances.
Well, I think this is where the US always makes the worst and wrongest assumptions about Cuban reality, is that they assume that under their maximum pressure campaign, which is, in every way, shape, or possible designed to basically make the Cuban economy collapse, to make Cuban society, the social fabric of Cuban society collapse. The reality is that the Cuban people are highly resilient and highly united. They have a sense of purpose, which for over 2 centuries has been defined by fighting for their ultimate and total independence from the US, from Spain, from any empire that tries to take over Cuba. And, immediately the response throughout Cuba was that the neighbors responded in an organized fashion. Those who could provide wood to make fire, to cook, did so. Pots and pans were brought out to make, meals for their neighbors. Whoever did have, a little shred of electricity at the hospitals or at certain institutions immediately shared it so that people could charge their phones and charge their other apparatuses. I mean, no one was left abandoned. And I think one of the things that Cuban society is well known for is that, it has such an incredible response to disaster system. In the middle of all this severe blackout, a Hurricane Oscar, hit Cuba. eastern Cuba, particularly the provinces of Guantanamo and Holguin. And you would think that how would a country be able to respond to this when they have no electricity? There's no way to communicate any information by television or by radio. And the reality is that the Cuban civil defense was up and running. Sadly, 7 people died as a result of the hurricane, but thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives were saved because people were still able to be evacuated. Their goods and their homes were saved, and greater disaster was averted. But this is a result of Cuba not necessarily having an unlimited amount of resources. What it has is unlimited capacity to take care of people, and that's based on its human resources.
Manolo, I think it's really important during a moment like this when just so much harm is being done to this country or that area or this area to recognize that there's a pattern here in who's carrying out these atrocities. And you've often done this, and I think it's important to do it. You'll connect what's happening in Cuba to what's happening in Gaza. I mean, obviously, they're very different things, but they're also not so dissimilar because it's the same forces that are stacked against them. So I'm just curious if you can explain how it's basically the same enemy there.
Well, I always like to point out that the history of the United States, the history of colonialism, the history of its becoming an imperialist power have been based on genocide. Genocide is part of the DNA of American government and American society. And it has extended this genocidal approach to life, to dealing with the difference in others, to dealing with literally the other through war and extermination, to death and destruction. We see it in Gaza, where people were kept under siege, under a blockade, under sanctions for years for simply having what the US considered was the wrong government. They shouldn't have elected the wrong government. The Cubans have had to pay for that same crime of electing and having their own government chosen by them, but happens to be the wrong one according to the US for over 60 years now. But these are not exceptional cases. This is, in fact, the rule. This is the norm that the US has been trying to impose on the world, almost as a tale to tell others. If you go down the path of independence, if you choose and try to make your own determinations as a country, as a people, you will pay the full price. And the price is there for everyone to see. The price of freedom is called Gaza, and the price of freedom is called Cuba. And we're in a moment in history where there is a uprising, a global uprising for justice, for liberation. We have a responsibility as part of that global uprising to say all sanctions and blockades must end now, because they go against our basic human dignity. I mean, to hear of the Palestinian students who are on scholarship in Cuba right now, when you hear their stories about how they grew up under siege in Gaza and what it is to be medical students in Cuba under siege now, you see the harrowing similarities. But you also see just an incredible identification and sympathy in their capacity to fight. Neither the people of Gaza nor the people of Cuba have given up. They have chosen that freedom is more precious than anything else. And for that, they're willing to live out the consequences of these sanctions. But that means then that the people in the United States have a deep responsibility to transform this reality, because it is on us. How long are we going to allow the people of Gaza and the people of Cuba to simply suffer under US sanctions? We have to end this now. And we've actually put a message out directly to President Biden saying, on Cuba, you have literally 90 days left in your administration to take Cuba off the state sponsors of terrorism list. It's a simple review that can be done on your simple stroke of a pen. The time is now. There's no valid reason to keep Cuba on that list. With that alone, it would be a huge change in Cuba's situation and its ability to respond to natural disasters and to this severe energy crisis.
hmm Well, real quick before we let you go, Manolo, on that point, I know that you all at the People's Forum are organizing various different points to assist the Cuban people in this difficult humanitarian situation. Well, I guess there it is on the bottom of the screen. I was going to say, where do people go to learn more? But say more about the efforts people will find if they go to the address there that we see on the screen.
Well, at the People's Forum, we are going to continue to advocate loudly and very publicly to take Cuba off this list. But we also feel it's a huge responsibility at this moment to send material aid. I mean, Cuba's facing this triple threat of a blockade, a severe energy crisis, and a hurricane. So we wanted to respond by sending urgently needed power generators, sending urgently needed food and other supplies, medicine, everything that could be used to relieve the Cuban people, particularly in the hardest hit province of Guantanamo. Now, we have joined with the Hatue Project and with the Party for Socialism and Liberation to launch a fundraiser that now has a stated goal of 100,000, but we know we can raise more because we feel that the people of the United States and people around the world feel sympathy for the Cuban people. They are our brothers and sisters, so we know we can raise more than $100,000. But all of this is already going to support the Cuban people. Already, right now, we have a plane being filled with power generators. We just need your help to get it to the finish line and to get more on their way in the next few days.
Well, as always, Manolo De Los Santos, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.